Palestine, probably the biggest plucky underdogs going right now, certainly in the tournament. It is their debut in the Asian Cup. They've had an incredible story, both in their qualification, but also their development as a team in the last decade. And earlier, we caught up with Middle East football expert and author James Montague, who told us all about it.
Hi, James. Thank you very much for joining us.
No problems.
Right, Palestine will naturally be sort of stereotyped as the plucky underdogs. But before we actually talk about how they'll get on the pitch, how significant is this for the country of Palestine? Are they going mad for this in the actual nation itself?
Well, I mean, this is the nub of the question, I think, because obviously they're not a country. They're not recognised internationally in any way. I mean, there's some forms of there's some movements at the moment to try to get recognition from the United Nations, and certain bodies do, but very little recognition internationally. But FIFA recognised them in 1998. So you can see from then onwards that the national football team has become incredibly important for Palestinians as a real expression of nationhood and of a future state. The team kind of embodies that in a way that no other institution in the West Bank and Gaza really does. So when you go and watch football matches there, and I've been lucky enough to go and see matches at the Faisal Al Husseini Stadium, which is their first ever home national stadium in Al Aram near Ramallah. I've seen women's internationals that have been absolutely packed with 12,000 people there, which is more than you'd get for a women's international in most countries in Europe. So you can see that football is obviously very important for the Palestinians, but the fact that there is an entity on an international stage with a Palestinian flag that is flown alongside other nations as equal is incredibly important, and will be incredibly important over the next month.
And it's not a meagre achievement either. Like, I'm aware that you've been following the team for a good while. They haven't always been a hugely impressive outfit, but this is pretty significant to be making their debut in. After the World Cup, this is arguably the biggest tournament they could possibly be in.
Well, I mean, first time I went to the West Bank was in 2006, and back then, football was it was dying in a way. I remember going to the Jericho International Stadium to watch a cup game because they couldn't have league games because there was Israeli movement restrictions. So Palestinian football is kind of, the problems are divided into two camps. On the one side, obviously the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, and obviously the problems between the Palestinians and the Israelis bleed into football, into almost every respect. So in 2006, you couldn't have a league because there were so many movement restrictions that followed the 2000 Intifada, an uprising against Israeli rule or occupation, or whichever way you want to say it. So, football was almost impossible to play. So you could only have cup competitions. I remember this first game that I went to that I wrote about in my book, When Friday Comes. The referee turns up half an hour late because, he was stuck at a checkpoint. So it was impossible to organise a league. And in that time, more political heavyweights in Palestinian society became involved in the national team because a lot of the players weren't allowed to leave the West Bank or Gaza to fulfill international fixtures when they had their first two World Cup qualification campaigns. So there was one famous example where they had only 11 players, no subs, for a match in Qatar because they had to play all their home games away from home. And then on the other side of that, there's also the division between Gaza and the West Bank, because essentially you have two separate leagues now operating. Many Palestinians say that a lot of the best players come from the Gaza Strip, and if you think of their best defender, Abdul Latif Badari, he's from Gaza. A lot of the best players are from Gaza, but they're frequently arrested, harassed. Some players have complained of torture by the Israeli authorities. Frequently are prevented from returning back to the West Bank. So all these problems are ongoing. But since 2006, there's been this incredible revolution where, really a guy called Jibril Rajoub, who was one of the most powerful political figures in Palestinian society and a former West Bank security advisor to Yasser Arafat, when he came on board, he managed to knock heads together, managed to ease some of the movement restrictions that were going on in the West Bank and that affected football, managed to have their first home international football match against Jordan at the stadium, which he was really instrumental in having built. And I went to the first competitive home game, the Olympic qualifier for the 2012 Olympics against Thailand. And then finally they had their World Cup qualification match, their first ever World Cup qualification match in 2011. So, and now they have a professional football league. They have a professional football league which pays wages which are comparable to the Israeli league. So from 2006 to now, you know, it's an incredible achievement. I can't really think of a quicker growth of a national team and of a league than has taken place, really, with such restrictions, with such political restrictions, with such social restrictions.
Wow. That's incredible to hear that. Sort of the speed of that timeline is unbelievable.
Yeah.
So, obviously, as you said, it's a huge achievement for them to be at that tournament, but are they there just to scamper around, wave, and be part of the celebrations? Or actually, could they do a bit of business? Could they actually pull off a shock or two? Are there any sort of personalities or players that, if we're watching the Asian Cup, we should look out for?
Yeah, I mean, the Asia Cup is. I mean, I know that Japan, the current champion. I went to the last one, and there were no real big shocks there. But I mean, you've got to remember, Iraq came, although historically a very powerful West Asian country. You know, they came out from nowhere in the middle of war, zero preparation, players living in exile to win in 2007. So, you know, these shocks do happen in the Asia Cup. But when you look at the team now, you look at Ashraf Newman, who is playing in Saudi Arabia, which is a very good professional league by Asian standards, was top scorer at the Challenge Cup, which is how they qualified for this, which is a kind of developmental tournament. They beat the Philippines in the final. He's one goal away from being top scorer in Palestinian history, which obviously is very short history. And you've got a player like Ismail Amor, who's playing back in the West Bank Premier League now. But I remember seeing him during the World Cup qualification campaign. He scored one of the greatest goals I've ever seen in my life.
Oh, really?
Beat, Afghanistan in Tajikistan 2-0.
We have got to look.
And it was such an obscure game that there's no. I can't find any footage of it anywhere, but it was absolutely incredible.
Oh, that's such a shame.
Which is great, but he was a really quick, tricky winger, and Abdul Latif Bendari is one of the best defenders I've seen in Asia in the past few years. I mean, what's interesting is that one of the players who isn't there, and I haven't found out yet whether this is down to injury or anything else, but Bendari and Omar Jaroun had a formidable partnership at the centre of defence for the Challenge Cup, and they didn't actually concede a goal the entire tournament. And Jaroun is American raised, born in Kuwait to American mother and a Jordanian Palestinian father, and plays, I think it's the Ottawa Fury, which is, I think it's the NASL or one of the second tier North American leagues. But he was immense, and he's not in the squad, and that could be an issue. I mean, it'd be fascinating to see how it goes. But this isn't like San Marino turning up at the European Championships. Because you've got to remember, in Europe, we have a system whereby everybody's put in the same pot together. Whereas for the Asian Cup, they've had this Challenge Cup, which has been a developmental tournament. And whoever wins it kind of gets a kind of free pass, which they probably wouldn't have got if they'd qualified at full strength. But saying that, looking at the strength of this Palestinian team and perhaps the weaknesses of the other teams in the group, there is a chance they could finish second there. And if they did, it would be one of the most incredible underdog football stories, I think, in modern times.
It's obviously an incredibly rich topic, which is why we wanted to talk to you. So thank you so much for your really unique and in-depth insight. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we can report on some fantastic performances with Palestine in the next couple of weeks, and we'll catch up with you hopefully then as well.
I hope so. I just hope they don't get hammered in the first game. I think they're playing Japan in the first game, and as long as they can keep
0-0,
it might be down to who loses less against Japan that qualifies in the second place.
Grind out 3-0 nils, and hopefully somehow a bit of goal difference will see them through. Fingers crossed. Thank you, James. Goodbye.
Always.